The air in the house on the bluff was always old. It held the ghosts of last year's magnolias and the cigar smoke of men long dead. A permanent, cloying sweetness that clung to the damask curtains and settled in the deep grain of the mahogany. But on this morning, the last Friday in November of 1857, the air held something new. It was a cold, metallic stillness, a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against the eardrums. Dr. Elias Croft felt it the moment he stepped from his buggy. The crunch of his boots on the gravel drive the only sound in a world that seemed to have stopped breathing. The house, known to all in Vicksburg as the Crest, was a monument to Alistair Beaumont's ambition. It was a white-pillared Parthenon of cotton money, staring out over the great, muddy curve of the Mississippi with an arrogant placidity. This morning, its white paint seemed corpse-like. In the thin winter light, no smoke curled from its four chimneys. No stable boy came running to take his horse. Only a single, black-faced buzzard, perched on the widow's walk like a patient undertaker, turned its featherless head to watch him. He knocked, the sound of his knuckles on the oak door unnaturally loud, an act of violence against the quiet. He waited. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time, calling out a name. Alistair? Eleanor? The silence that answered was heavier than before. It was a knowing silence. Elias tried the handle. Unlocked. The door swung inward on oiled hinges, whispering open into the grand foyer. The smell hit him first. It was not the familiar scent of beeswax and lemon oil. It was the acrid, coppery odor of vomit, overlaid with something sour and final. The grandfather clock in the hall stood silent. Its pendulum, a frozen brass tier, its hands, stopped at 5 minutes past 2. The air was frigid, the hearths cold and gray with ash. He moved into the dining room, his medical bag a dead weight in his hand. And there they were. The tableau was a masterpiece of domestic horror, a wax museum of a feast gone wrong. Alistair Beaumont was slumped forward in his high-backed chair at the head of the table, his face buried in a platter of congealed turkey. His hand, still clutching a silver carving knife, was draped over the bird's carcass as if in a last, desperate embrace. His wife, Eleanor, was on the floor, her silk gown fanned out around her like a pale blue shroud. Her eyes, wide and staring, were fixed on a point on the ceiling where a spider was methodically building its web. Her mouth was a perfect, dark O of surprise. The children, Thomas and little Clara, were still at the table. Thomas, a boy of 9, had toppled sideways, his cheek pressed against the white linen tablecloth, a trail of dark bile leading from his lips to a pool on the floor. His toy soldier, a brightly painted zouave, lay beside his overturned plate. 6-year-old Clara was the most placid. She sat upright in her chair, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, her head tilted back as if listening for a distant lullaby. A single perfect porcelain doll lay at her feet, its painted smile a grotesque mockery of the scene. The remnants of the Thanksgiving feast were a study in decay. The half-eaten food, the overturned goblets of wine staining the cloth like old blood, the fat-slicked gravy grown cold and waxy. In the center of the table, a magnificent pumpkin pie sat almost untouched, a single slice missing. Elias leaned closer, his stomach churning. He could see tiny dark specks, almost like ground pepper, mixed into the rich, orange filling. He backed away, his breath fogging in the cold air. His gaze swept the room, cataloging the details his mind would later replay in sleepless, waking nightmares. The portraits on the wall, ancestors in stiff collars and lace, seemed to watch him with accusing eyes. The fire in the hearth had died, leaving behind the skeletal remains of logs. Everything was still. Everything was accounted for. The silver, the crystal, the family. But someone was missing. He knew their names, the way a man knows the names of his own livestock. There was James, the stable boy. Old Hetty, the laundress. A young girl, Sarah, who helped in the house. And there was the cook. The woman who had prepared this final, terrible supper. The one they called Mary. Her absence was the loudest thing in the silent house. It was a screaming void that defined the entire scene. Elias Croft, a man of science and logic, felt a primal shiver trace its way up his spine. He was not just standing in a room with 4 dead bodies. He was standing in the epicenter of an act of will. This was not sickness. This was not an accident. This was a reckoning, served on the Beaumont's finest china. He could almost feel her presence lingering in the cold air, a phantom scent of wood smoke and bitter herbs, the ghost of a patient, terrible vengeance. He looked again at the pie, at the dark, almost invisible specks, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the November air, that the devil had come to Thanksgiving dinner at the Crest, and he had come in the form of a woman named Mary. The heat of a Vicksburg summer was a physical presence. It rose in shimmering waves from the packed dirt of the streets and settled in a suffocating blanket over the cotton fields that stretched green and white to the horizon. It was a wet, living heat that made the Spanish moss drip in the Mississippi River steam like a witch's cauldron. Inside the kitchen of the Crest, it was a hell of its own making. The great iron stove radiated a dragon's breath, and the air was a thick soup of rendering lard, boiling greens, and the ever-present, metallic tang of sweat. Mary moved through this inferno with a practiced, deliberate economy of motion. There were no wasted steps, no hurried gestures. Her hands, long-fingered and strong, could butcher a hog, scale a fish, or flute the edge of a pie crust with equal precision. She was a tall woman, built of lean muscle, with a face that seemed carved from old, dark wood. Her eyes were the most remarkable thing about her. They were deep-set and watchful, and in their depths they held a stillness that was unnerving. They missed nothing. The weevil in the flower, the faint tremor in Eleanor Beaumont's hand as she reached for the morning laudanum, the way Master Alister's gaze would linger on the smooth brown skin of the new housegirl, Sarah. Mary's world was circumscribed by the kitchen, the smokehouse, and the small, sweltering cabin she shared with old Hetty behind the main house. But within that world, she was a queen. The kitchen was her domain, a kingdom of copper pots and cast-iron skillets. Here, she translated the raw materials of the plantation, the vegetables from the garden, the meat from the smokehouse, the flour from the mill, into the sustenance that fueled the Beaumonts' elegant lives. She knew their tastes, their appetites, their secret cravings. She knew that Master Alister liked his gravy dark and rich, that Mistress Eleanor favored sweets but would only pick at them in public, that young Thomas would gorge himself on buttermilk biscuits until he was sick, and that little Clara had a fondness for the brown, crispy skin of a roasted chicken. She knew the geography of their desires. Her own past was a country she rarely visited. There were fragmented memories, like shards of a broken mirror, a mother's face, the calloused hand of a husband named John, the phantom weight of a baby in her arms. These things had been taken from her by the indifferent arithmetic of the trade. John had been sold south to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, a place spoken of in whispers as a death sentence. Her son, Samuel, had been sold at the age of 5, his small hand ripped from hers on the auction block in Natchez. She could still feel the ghost of his grip, could still hear his cries echoing in the chambers of her heart. Alister Beaumont had bought her for her skill in the kitchen. He had seen it as a sound investment, like buying a prime piece of riverfront land or a stud bull. He never saw the woman behind the skillet, only the asset. To him she was an extension of the stove, a tool that produced his meals. He was a man obsessed with appearances, with the performance of mastery. His house was the grandest, his cotton the whitest, his wife the most beautiful, his slaves the most disciplined. Any crack in this facade, any challenge to his absolute authority, was met with a swift and terrible correction. Mary had seen his corrections. She had seen him use the rawhide whip on James for a perceived insolence, the leather biting into the boy's back and leaving behind a map of permanent rage. She had heard the chilling, quiet threats he used to control his wife, threats that left no physical marks, but hollowed Eleanor out from the inside, leaving her a fragile porcelain doll, beautiful and empty. Eleanor, in turn, wielded her own brand of power. It was a petty, passive tyranny. She would find fault where there was none. A speck of dust on a mantelpiece, a slightly scorched biscuit, and her displeasure would fall not on her husband, but on the servants. It was a redirected misery, the only kind she was allowed. She was particularly cruel to Sarah, the new girl, whose youth and unbroken spirit seemed to serve as a constant, galling reminder of everything Eleanor had lost or never had. Mary watched it all, from the quiet heat of her kitchen. She was the house's confessional, its silent witness. She heard the arguments that drifted down from the master bedroom, the sounds of weeping, the sharp slap of a hand against a cheek. She saw the fear in Sarah's eyes when Master Alistair walked by, the way the girl would make herself small, trying to become invisible. She saw the sounds Colleen D&B Wall, slow poisoning of the whole house, a spiritual rot that emanated from the master and his wife and seeped into the very foundations of the crest. One sweltering afternoon in late August, the rot became unbearable. Little Clara had been playing near the kitchen door with her doll. Sarah, in a moment of exhaustion, had sat on the steps to catch her breath. Alistair came striding around the corner, his riding crop tapping against his boots. He saw Sarah resting and his face darkened. It was not the idleness that angered him. It was the sight of it, the public display of it. It was a flaw in his perfect picture. "Get up, girl," he said, his voice low and cold. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with terror. "You think I pay for you to sit and admire the scenery?" He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "You are here to work. Is that understood?" "Yes, master," she whispered, her voice trembling. He was not satisfied. He needed to make an example. He raised the riding crop. Little Clara, who had been watching, let out a small cry and clutched her doll. "Papa, no!" Alistair hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze flicking to his daughter. In that moment, Mary stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. She moved without a sound, placing herself between Alistair and Sarah. She did not look at him. She did not speak. She simply stood there, a silent, unmovable presence. Her stillness was more of a challenge than any shout could have been. Alistair's eyes narrowed. He saw the defiance in her posture, the silent rebuke. He could not strike Sarah now without also striking at the authority of his cook, the woman who held the secrets to his daily contentment. And he could not do it in front of his daughter, whose innocent plea had already complicated the simple physics of his rage. He lowered the crop, his face a mask of fury. "See that she earns her keep, Mary," he hissed, his voice tight with constrained violence, "or you will all answer for it." He turned and strode away, the sound of his boots on the gravel like angry punctuation. Mary remained still for a long moment after he was gone. Then she turned to Sarah, whose face was streaked with tears. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She didn't touch her. She simply looked at the girl, and in her deep, quiet eyes, Sarah saw not pity, but a cold, hard understanding. "Go fetch the water," Mary said, her voice even. "The work is not done." As she turned back to the heat of the kitchen, Mary felt a shift inside her. The passive endurance that had been her shield for so many years was beginning to crack. The poison of the house was seeping into her, but it was not hollowing her out. It was hardening. It was turning into something else, something patient, something that could wait. The seeds of vengeance, long dormant in the barren ground of her heart, had just been watered with a master's rage and a child's fear, and in the oppressive, suffocating heat of the Mississippi summer they began to sprout. The Mississippi was a god in Vicksburg. It gave and it took away. It carved the bluffs, carried the cotton to New Orleans, and sometimes, in its swollen, muddy fury, it reclaimed the land, swallowing fields and homes with an indifferent gulp. It was a constant presence, a low brown murmur at the edge of hearing, a promise of a world beyond the bluffs, a pathway to freedom or to a watery grave. Mary often stood at the edge of the Beaumont property, where the manicured gardens gave way to a tangle of wild woods that plunged down to the riverbank, and watched its slow, relentless passage. The river knew how to wait. It was here, in this liminal space between the master's world and the wild one, that she found the plant. It grew in a shaded, damp spot, near a cluster of crumbling stones that marked the graves of slaves who had died at the crest long before her time. Old Hetty had shown it to her once. Hetty was a keeper of the old ways, a woman whose memory stretched back to the stories her own grandmother had brought from Africa. She knew the language of roots and leaves, the secrets of the earth that the white masters, with all their books and learning, could never comprehend. "That one there," Hetty had said, pointing a gnarled finger at the plant. It was a coarse, sprawling weed with large, jagged leaves and beautiful, trumpet-shaped flowers that opened a ghostly white in the twilight. Datura. The white folk call it jimsonweed or thornapple. We call it the devil's trumpet. "What does it do?" Mary had asked. Hetty's eyes, cloudy with age, had seemed to look through Mary into the past. "It opens a door. Some who go through find God. Most find madness. It can make a man see his own sins dancing in front of him. A little can heal a fever. Too much closes the door for good." She had spat on the ground near the plant. "It's a powerful medicine, and a powerful poison. All depends on the hand that holds it." The plant had a strange beauty. Its flowers, which bloomed at night, gave off a heady, sweet scent, intoxicating and dangerous. And after the flowers came the fruit, a spiky, egg-shaped pod that looked like a medieval weapon. When it dried, it would burst, releasing dozens of small, dark seeds. Mary had watched it through the seasons, a silent observer of its life cycle. She had seen the way it thrived in the shadows, ignored and unassuming, holding its terrible power in secret. In the plant she saw a reflection of herself. The idea did not come to her in a flash of lightning. It grew slowly, organically, like the datura itself. It started as a dark whisper in the back of her mind, a hypothetical question she would ask herself in the dead of night. What if? What if the endless cycle of servitude, of small humiliations and great sorrows, could be broken? What if the source of the poison that infected the house could be treated with a poison of its own? The thought terrified her, but it also held a seductive power. It was the first time in years she had felt a sense of agency, of control over her own destiny. The knowledge of the datura was a weapon she carried in the arsenal of her mind, a secret no one could take from her. The incident with Sarah and the riding crop had been the catalyst. After that, Mary began to notice things with a new, heightened clarity. She saw the way Alistair's pride was a brittle thing, how his fear of losing control, of being seen as less than a perfect master, drove his cruelty. He was preparing for Thanksgiving, planning a grand feast for neighbors and business associates. It was to be a celebration of his success, a display of his wealth and power. "We will show them what a Vicksburg Thanksgiving is, Eleanor," he declared one evening, his voice booming in the dining room as Mary served the soup. "The finest turkey, the best wine, everything must be perfect." Perfection. The word echoed in Mary's mind. A perfect family, in a perfect house, celebrating their perfect life. It was a lie, a beautiful, fragile lie built on the backs of people they owned. And Mary, the cook, was the architect of its central ritual, the feast. She began to visit the datura plant more often. In the cool of the early mornings, before the house was awake, she would slip down to the overgrown cemetery. She started gathering the spiky seed pods, her hands careful to avoid the thorns. She would hide them in a hollowed-out log deep in the woods, far from her cabin. Old Hetty watched her. The old woman saw the new hardness in Mary's eyes, the way her silence had deepened, had become something heavier. One evening, as they sat outside their cabin, Hetty spoke, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "The river washes many things away," she said, looking not at Mary but at the darkening sky, "but it can't wash the stain from a soul." Mary did not reply. She knew what Hetty was saying. It was a warning. But the time for warnings was past. The current was already pulling her, and she had no desire to fight it. The preparations were a dark sacrament. In the secrecy of the deep woods, she used a smooth river stone to crush the pods, to release the tiny, kidney-shaped seeds. She ground them into a fine, dark powder, a gritty dust that smelled of earth, and something bitter, something ancient. She wrapped the powder in a small piece of cloth and tucked it deep into the pocket of her dress. It was a small, light thing, but it felt as heavy as a gravestone. The house, meanwhile, was buzzing with the nervous energy of the coming holiday. Eleanor, high-strung and anxious, flitted from room to room, issuing contradictory orders. She demanded the silver be polished until it shone like mirrors, that the floors be scrubbed until they gleamed. Her anxiety was a fever that infected the entire household. She slapped Sarah for accidentally dropping a saucer, then burst into tears of frustration in her room, her sobs audible through the floorboards. Alistair, for his part, was expansive, playing the role of the generous patriarch. He purchased a massive turkey from a nearby farm and brought in barrels of oysters from the Gulf. He spoke of the feast as if it were a military campaign he was orchestrating. He was oblivious to the simmering resentments, the quiet despair that filled the spaces between his pronouncements. He saw only the reflections of his own greatness in the polished silver and the shining faces of his children. One afternoon, a week before Thanksgiving, Mary was kneading dough in the kitchen. The rhythmic work of her hands, pushing and folding, was usually a comfort, a meditation. But now, her mind was a maelstrom. She thought of her son, Samuel. She tried to picture his face, but the image was fading, blurring at the edges, replaced by the face of young Thomas Beaumont, who had his father's eyes and his mother's petulance. She thought of her husband, John, and his image was supplanted by Alistair, his smug, proprietary smile. The Beaumonts were not just her masters. They had become ghosts, usurpers of her own memories, colonizers of her soul. Little Clara came into the kitchen, a rare visitor to Mary's domain. She was holding her porcelain doll, its painted smile unblinking. "Mary?" the girl said, her voice small. "Mama is crying again." Mary stopped kneading. She looked at the child, at her pristine white dress and the innocent confusion in her blue eyes. For a moment, a wave of something akin to pity washed over her. This child was not her enemy. She was as much a prisoner of this house, of her father's ambition and her mother's unhappiness, as anyone else. "Go to your room, child," Mary said, her voice softer than usual. "Your mama will be fine." Clara hesitated. "Will you make a pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving, Mary?" "It's my favorite." Mary looked down at her hands, white with flour. Flour that would be used to make the crust that would hold the filling that would hold the seeds. "Yes, child," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "I'll make you a pie." As Clara skipped out of the kitchen, Mary felt the last vestiges of doubt recede. It was not just about vengeance for herself, for John, for Samuel. It was about cleansing. It was about stopping the poison from spreading to another generation. She was not just a murderer in the making. She was a physician, preparing a radical, desperate cure for a disease that had no other name than Beaumont. The house had to be purged. The sickness had to be cut out at its root. She looked out the window, past the manicured lawn to where the woods began, where the devil's trumpet waited to bloom in the coming twilight. Its sweet, deadly perfume was already on the air. The week leading up to Thanksgiving was a blur of frantic, orchestrated labor. The crest was being scoured and polished into a state of unnatural perfection. The air smelled of beeswax and roasting nuts, of money and expectation. For the enslaved, it was a time of heightened tension. The workload doubled, and the tempers of the master and mistress, already short, were worn to a thread. Every task was performed under a microscope of scrutiny. A spilled drop of water, a smudged window pane, could result in a sharp word or a sharper blow. Mary moved through the chaos like a ghost at the center of a storm. Her calm was absolute, her efficiency unnerving. While others scurried with anxious energy, she performed her duties with a chilling, methodical grace. She brined the massive turkey, rendered the lard for the pie crusts, and clarified the butter. Each act was precise, deliberate, a step in a ritual only she understood. The small cloth packet of datura powder was a constant weight in her pocket, a cold promise against her thigh. Sarah, the young housegirl, watched Mary with a mixture of awe and fear. She saw the change in the older woman. The quiet resilience had been replaced by something harder, something brittle. Mary's eyes, once just watchful, now seemed to possess a terrible, clairvoyant depth. "You're scaring me, Mary," Sarah whispered one evening as they sat in the cabin. Hetty was asleep, her quiet snores a rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. Mary looked at her, her face illuminated by the flickering light of a single tallow candle. "Fear is a cage, child. They put you in it, and you lock the door yourself." "What are you going to do?" Sarah pressed, her voice barely audible. "I'm going to set a table," Mary said, and the simple, domestic words held a weight that made Sarah shiver. "That's all. Just set a table." On the Wednesday before the feast, Alistair Beaumont made a fatal mistake. He sold James, the stable boy. A horse trader from Natchez had come by and offered a good price, and Alistair, ever the opportunist, had accepted without a second thought. They came for James in the late afternoon, two burly men who bound his hands and led him away like livestock. James didn't fight. He just walked, his head held high, but Mary saw the single tear that traced a path through the dust on his cheek. The act sent a shockwave of grief and terror through the slave quarters. James was well liked, a featweight friend to many. His departure was a stark, brutal reminder of their powerlessness, of the casual cruelty that governed their lives. Alistair had ripped a hole in their small community for the price of a few silver dollars, and he had done it on the eve of a holiday meant to celebrate bounty and gratitude. That night Mary did not sleep. She sat in the darkness of her cabin, the weight in her pocket feeling less like a stone and more like a key. The sale of James was not just another cruelty. It was a desecration. Alistair had tainted the holiday, had made a mockery of the very idea of thankfulness. He had given her the final justification she needed. Her act would no longer be just a personal vengeance. It would be a response, an answer to the crime of his existence. Thanksgiving morning dawned cold and gray. A thick fog rolled in from the river, swallowing the house and muffling the world in a blanket of damp silence. The kitchen, however, was an island of frantic heat and light. Mary had been up since before dawn, stoking the fire in the massive stove, her face and arms gleaming with sweat in the orange glow. The day unfolded in a symphony of sensory details. The rhythmic thud of Mary's knife on the cutting board as she chopped onions and celery. The hiss of butter in a hot pan. The rich, savory aroma of the turkey roasting, its skin slowly turning a deep, burnished gold. The sweet, spicy scent of cinnamon and nutmeg from the pies cooling on the windowsill. To an outsider, it was a scene of bountiful, festive preparation. To Mary, it was the meticulous assembly of a weapon. Eleanor, dressed in her finest silk, came into the kitchen around noon. She was a bundle of nerves, her face pale, her hands fluttering like trapped birds. "Is everything on schedule, Mary? Mr. Henderson and his wife will be here at 2. Everything must be perfect." "Everything is on schedule, mistress," Mary said without looking up from the sweet potatoes she was mashing. Eleanor drifted around the kitchen, touching things, rearranging utensils, a useless, anxious specter in Mary's domain. "The pumpkin pies, did you make them just as Clara likes, with extra spice?" "Yes, mistress." "Good, good." Eleanor paused, wringing her hands. She looked at Mary, truly looked at her, for the first time in a long while. She seemed to be searching for something in the cook's impassive face. "You are a good cook, Mary, a valuable asset." It was meant as a compliment, the highest one Eleanor could conceive of. Mary felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. An asset. A thing. A tool. She simply nodded. And Eleanor, satisfied, drifted back out of the kitchen, her rustling silk fading down the hall. The moment came in the late afternoon. The guests had been delayed by the fog. The family was growing restless. Mary was alone in the kitchen, putting the final touches on the meal. The pumpkin pie, a perfect, gleaming disk of orange, sat on the counter. It was time. Her hands did not tremble. She reached into her pocket and took out the small cloth packet. She unwrapped it carefully. The powder was fine, dark, and odorless. It looked like a pinch of common earth. With the tip of a knife, she lifted a small amount. The quantity she had measured in her mind 100 times. It was a poison of delayed effect, of creeping madness. It would not be instantaneous. It would give her time. She looked at the pie. Clara's favorite. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. The image of the little girl's face, her innocent request, flashed in her mind. This was the precipice, the final, irrevocable step. She thought of her Samuel, of his small hand being torn from hers. She thought of James being led away in chains. She thought of Sarah's fear, and Eleanor's casual cruelty, and Alistair's monstrous pride. One child's life against the weight of it all. The scales of justice in her mind, long broken, tipped decisively. She sprinkled the powder over the pie, then used a spatula to gently fold it into the top layer of the filling, smoothing the surface until it was once again a perfect, unblemished mirror of autumn. The specks of datura disappeared into the dark spice of the nutmeg and cinnamon, becoming invisible, becoming one with the feast. She took a deep breath. The air was thick with the smells of the meal she had created, a meal that smelled of home, of celebration, of family. And now it also smelled of death. The Abialil Cetas work was done. All that was left was to serve the table. The fog outside had thickened as dusk fell, pressing against the window panes of the dining room like a shroud. Inside, however, the world was a bubble of golden light and warmth. A fire roared in the great hearth, its flames dancing on the polished silver and reflecting in the cut crystal of the wine goblets. The long mahogany table was a landscape of abundance, groaning under the weight of the feast Mary had prepared. The turkey, glistening and magnificent, sat enthroned on its platter, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, gravy boats, candied yams, and cornbread dressing. It was a portrait of prosperity, a perfect lie. Alistair Beaumont, at the head of the table, was in his element. The delay of his guests, the Hendersons, had initially annoyed him, but now, with his family gathered around him, he felt a surge of patriarchal pride. He was the king of this small, perfect kingdom. He raised his glass of claret. "A toast," he boomed, his voice filling the room. "To family, to health, and to the bounty that God and our own hard work have provided us. To the crest." "To the crest," Eleanor echoed, her smile as fragile as spun glass. The children, Thomas and Clara, dutifully raised their glasses of milk. Mary moved around the table with a silent, spectral grace. She filled the water glasses, offered bread, and ladled gravy onto plates. Her face was an impassive mask, but her senses were on fire. She was aware of every detail. The scrape of a fork against a plate, the sound of Alistair's chewing, the way the candlelight caught the gold in Clara's hair. She was both a part of the scene and entirely separate from it, a ghost watching a play whose tragic end only she knew. They ate with gusto. Alistair carved the turkey with a surgeon's precision, doling out slices of white and dark meat. Thomas, his eyes wide with hunger, piled his plate high. Even Eleanor seemed to relax, her earlier anxiety dissolving in the warmth of the fire and the wine. They talked of inconsequential things. A new horse Alistair was thinking of buying, a dress Eleanor had seen in a catalog from New Orleans, Thomas's progress with his Latin tutor. It was a symphony of normalcy, a terrifyingly ordinary family meal. Mary watched them eat the food she had cooked, the food that was nourishing them, sustaining them, even as the instrument of their doom sat waiting on the sideboard. She felt a strange, cold detachment, the calm of a physician observing an experiment. There was no hatred in her heart now, no rage. There was only a profound, hollow stillness. After the main course, she cleared the plates, her movements fluid and unhurried, the remnants of the feast, turkey bones, a smear of gravy, a half-eaten biscuit, seemed like artifacts from a lost civilization. She brought in the desserts, a bowl of syllabub and the magnificent pumpkin pie. Clara clapped her hands. "The pie, Mary, you made the pie!" "Yes, child," Mary said, her voice a low murmur. She placed the pie in the center of the table. Its spicy sweet aroma filled the air. Alistair beamed. "Well done, Mary. It looks magnificent. You see, Eleanor? Perfection." Mary cut the first slice for Clara, a small, perfect wedge. She placed it on a porcelain plate and set it before the girl. Then she cut a slice for Thomas and for Eleanor, and finally a large one for the master of the house. She herself would take none. She retreated to the shadows near the kitchen door, her role as servant complete, her role as executioner, now only a matter of waiting. She watched them lift the first forkfuls to their lips. The texture of the pie, the blend of pumpkin and spice, the sweetness of the sugar. It was a taste of childhood, of autumn, of home, a taste of betrayal. The first sign was subtle. It came about 20 minutes after they had finished the pie. Alistair was telling a long, self-congratulatory story about a cotton deal he had recently closed. He paused, mid-sentence, a look of confusion on his face. He blinked, as if trying to clear his vision. "What was I saying?" he mumbled, shaking his head slightly. Eleanor, who had been staring into the fire, let out a soft, giggling laugh that had no mirth in it. "The walls are breathing, Alistair," she said, her voice dreamy. "They're breathing with the fire." Alistair stared at his wife. "What foolishness are you talking, woman? Have you had too much? Wine?" But his own words were beginning to slur, the edges blurring. Thomas pushed his chair back from the table. "My hands feel big," he said, holding them up and staring at them as if they belonged to a stranger. "They're getting bigger." It was beginning. The devil's trumpet was starting its slow, terrible song in their minds. The datura was opening the door. Mary stood perfectly still in the shadows, her heart a cold, heavy drum in her chest. This was the moment she had imagined 1,000 times, yet the reality of it was stranger, more grotesque than anything she could have conjured. Clara was the quietest. She was humming to her doll, which she had placed on the table beside her plate. She began to have a conversation with it, her voice a high, sing-song whisper. She seemed happy, lost in a world of her own making. The chaos escalated quickly. Alistair tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He knocked over his wine glass, the dark red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like a blooming wound. "What is this?" he roared, his voice thick with a mixture of rage and a new, dawning terror. "What's happening?" His eyes, wide and unfocused, darted around the room, seeing things that weren't there. He swatted at the air, as if fighting off invisible insects. Eleanor was now weeping, great, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. "The faces!" she cried, pointing a trembling finger at the ancestral portraits on the wall. "They're melting! Their eyes are melting!" Thomas began to scream, a high, piercing shriek of pure terror. He crawled under the table, babbling about spiders, his words a nonsensical jumble. Through it all, Mary watched. She was the anchor of reality in a room that had come unmoored from its senses. She watched the proud, arrogant Alistair Beaumont reduced to a terrified, stumbling animal, swatting at phantoms. She watched the fragile, beautiful Eleanor collapse into a weeping heap, her private miseries made public and monstrous. She watched their children, lost in their own private hells. Alistair's wild gaze finally landed on her, standing in the doorway. Recognition, or something like it, flickered in his eyes. "You," he croaked, pointing a shaking finger. "Mary, what have you?" He took a stumbling step toward her, his face a mask of contorted fury and confusion. He reached the center of the room, and then his body convulsed. He pitched forward, crashing onto the table with a sickening thud, his face landing in the remains of the turkey. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime. It was 9 o'clock. The sound, usually so stately and reassuring, was now a death knell, counting out the seconds in a world gone mad. Eleanor's sobs subsided into a low moan. She slid from her chair to the floor, her body limp. Thomas went silent under the table. Only little Clara was still humming to her doll, her head tilted back, a serene, unknowing smile on her face, as she drifted into a sleep from which she would not wake. The house fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire and the ticking of the clock. The feast was over. Mary stepped out of the shadows and into the golden, horrific light of the dining room. She looked at the tableau she had created. The perfect family, the perfect house, now a perfect ruin. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a vast, empty quietness inside her, a space as cold and still as the room around her. She did not run. Not yet. She began to clean. Methodically, she started to gather the plates, her hands steady. She scraped the poisoned food into a bucket. She moved around the bodies as if they were merely furniture. It was an act of profound, chilling control, a final assertion of her dominion over this house. She was erasing the evidence, not of the crime, but of the life that had preceded it. When she was done, she walked through the silent house, extinguishing the lamps one by one, plunging the rooms into darkness. Finally, she stood at the back door, the one that led from her kitchen into the foggy night. She took one last look at the house, a dark, silent tomb on the bluff. She had not just killed a family, she had killed an idea, the idea of the crest. She put on a simple cloak, took a small bundle of bread and dried meat she had prepared, and stepped out into the fog. The damp, cold air was the first breath of freedom she had ever known. It tasted of the river, and of the long, dark road ahead. The discovery of the Beaumonts sent a bolt of pure, unadulterated terror through Vicksburg. Dr. Croft's initial, quiet horror quickly gave way to a citywide panic. The story spread like wildfire, mutating with each telling. It wasn't just a poisoning. It was the opening salvo of a full-blown slave insurrection. It was Nat Turner come again, a nightmare resurrected in their own backyard. The white citizens, who lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade fear of the people they enslaved, saw their deepest anxieties made flesh. The Warren County Sheriff, a portly, grim-faced man named Jedediah Thorne, immediately formed a posse. They descended on the crest like a plague of locusts, their authority absolute, and their methods brutal. They rounded up the remaining slaves, old Hetty and Sarah, and dragged them to the county jail. The interrogation was swift and merciless. Thorne, Attai, man who believed fear was the most effective tool of justice, used the whip and the threat of the pyre to extract a confession. Sarah, terrified and broken, told them everything she suspected, her words tumbling out in a torrent of sobs. She spoke of Mary's strange quietness, of her visits to the woods, of her chilling words about setting a table. It was enough. Old Hetty remained silent. She sat on the cold stone floor of her cell, her ancient eyes holding a wisdom and a sorrow that Thorne's brutality could not penetrate. He could break her body, but her spirit was beyond his reach. Her silence was its own form of testimony, a quiet condemnation that infuriated him more than any lie. The manhunt for Mary was immediate and massive. Slave patrols, deputized posses, and grim-faced volunteers with bloodhounds fanned out from Vicksburg, combing the swamps and canebrakes. A bounty was meaty, placed on her head. $500 for her capture, alive or dead. The notice, printed on cheap handbills, described her as tall, cunning, and, quote, possessed of a devilish intelligence. In a matter of days, Mary of Vicksburg was transformed from an anonymous cook into a legendary monster, a bogey woman to frighten children, and a symbol of the ever-present threat lurking just beneath the surface of their orderly society. The consequences for the broader enslaved community were devastating. Any hint of insubordination was met with immediate and overwhelming violence. Curfews were tightened. Patrols were doubled. A dozen men from neighboring plantations were rounded up on the flimsiest of pretexts and summarily lynched, their bodies left hanging from the branches of oak trees as a gruesome warning. The Beaumont poisoning had given the masters the excuse they needed to tighten the cane screws of their dominion, to reinforce the cage of fear. Mary's act of liberation for herself had resulted in a deeper imprisonment for thousands. It was a bitter, tragic irony she could never have fully foreseen. And of Mary herself? She became a ghost, a whisper on the wind. She had vanished into the fog-shrouded landscape as if the earth itself had swallowed her. For weeks, reports of sightings trickled in. A farmer claimed to have seen a tall woman matching her description near the Big Black River. A riverboat captain swore he'd seen her on the Louisiana shore, moving through the cypress trees like a shadow. None of the reports could be substantiated. The dogs would lose her scent at the water's edge, their baying turning to frustrated whines. It was as if she had dissolved into the Mississippi itself. We can only imagine her journey, the cold nights spent huddled in hollow logs, the gnawing hunger, the constant, heart-pounding fear of discovery. The nights guided by the cold, distant light of the North Star, the pole star of freedom. We see her moving through the primordial landscape of the Mississippi swamps, a world of sucking mud, tangled vines, and ancient cypress knees that looked like praying monks. The Spanish moss, hanging in funereal drapes, would brush against her face, a ghostly caress. The night would be alive with sounds: the hoot of an owl, the splash of an alligator, the chorus of bullfrogs that sounded like a congregation of lost souls. In this world, she was no longer Mary the cook, Mary the slave. She was an elemental being, stripped of everything but the will to survive. The skills she had learned in the kitchen, patience, observation, a deep knowledge of the natural world, were now the tools of her freedom. She could read the signs of the land, find edible roots, and move with a silence that made her one with the shadows. Perhaps she met others on her journey, fugitives like herself, passengers on the secret, treacherous railroad to the north. Perhaps she found help from a sympathetic Quaker farmer or a free black family who risked everything to offer a meal and a hiding place. Or perhaps she traveled entirely alone, trusting no one, her only companion, the memory of what she had done, a memory that was both a burden and a source of incredible, terrible strength. Did she make it? Did she reach the free states of the North, cross into Canada, and breathe the air of a place where she was not property? Or did the river, the great indifferent god of the Delta, claim her in the end? Did a fever take her in the swamps, her body returning to the mud, unmourned and unmarked? Did a patrol's bullet find her in the dark? No one knows. Her trail goes cold at the edge of the water, the point where history loses its grip and legend takes over. Her fate remains ambiguous, a question mark scrawled across the pages of the past. And in that ambiguity lies her power. By escaping a known end, she escaped definition. She could not be made into a simple cautionary tale of a slave who was caught and punished. She remained at large, not just in the physical world, but in the imagination. For the white planters of Vicksburg, she was a permanent, terrifying specter of rebellion. For the enslaved, she became a myth, a whispered legend of impossible defiance. They said she could walk on water, that she could talk to the birds, that she had turned into a black panther and vanished into the wild. She was the woman who had served death on a silver platter and walked away clean. The crest, the house on the bluff, became a haunted place. No one would buy it. The story of the Thanksgiving poisoning had seeped into its walls, a permanent stain on its white-pillared grandeur. The gardens grew wild, the paint peeled. The windows, dark and empty, stared out over the river like the vacant eyes of a skull. It stood for years as a monument to the day the bottom fell out of Vicksburg's perfect world, a testament to the fact that the most brutal systems create the most desperate and terrible forms of resistance. Mary was gone, but her act remained, a silent, terrible scream echoing from the empty rooms of the house on the hill. April 1863. The air over Vicksburg is no longer thick with the scent of magnolias, but with the acrid smoke of gunpowder. The pastoral landscape has become a pock-marked hellscape of trenches and fortifications. The city, the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, is under siege. General Grant's Army of the Tennessee has it in a stranglehold, and the constant, percussive thunder of artillery fire is the new rhythm of daily life. A young Union soldier, a corporal from a farm in Ohio named Samuel Shaw, finds himself on a scouting mission along the river bluffs north of the city. He is tired, hungry, and haunted by the things he has seen. The war has aged him beyond his 19 years. As he moves through a section of woods overgrown with kudzu and tangled vines, he stumbles upon it, a great, decaying mansion, its white pillars stained with mildew, its windows shattered. It is the Crest. He approaches it with caution, his rifle at the ready. The place feels profoundly wrong, exuding an aura of deep-seated decay that has nothing to do with the war. The front door hangs open on a single hinge. He steps inside. The foyer is a ruin. Dust lies thick as snow on the floor, and cobwebs hang like tattered funeral bunting from the crystal chandelier. He moves into the dining room. The great table is still there, though its polished surface is warped and cracked. A few pieces of broken china lie scattered on the floor. In the center of the room, directly beneath the chandelier, a small, pale object catches his eye. He bends down and picks it up. It is a porcelain doll, its painted face miraculously intact, its smile fixed and serene. A chill runs down his spine that has nothing to do with the damp air. This place is not just abandoned, it is cursed. Later that week, his company helps to liberate a group of contrabands, enslaved people who have fled the plantations and sought refuge behind Union lines. They are setting up a camp, and Samuel is tasked with distributing rations. He notices an old woman sitting apart from the others, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes holding a deep, ancient weariness. He offers her a piece of hardtack and a strip of salted pork. She takes it with a nod of thanks. He, feeling a need to connect, to speak of something other than the war, mentions the ruined mansion he found on the bluff. A strange, sad place, he says. Looked like everyone just vanished. The old woman's eyes focus on him with a new intensity. He doesn't know her name, but it is Sarah. She is no longer the terrified young girl from the Beaumont kitchen, but a woman hardened by years of survival. "They didn't vanish," she says, her voice a low, raspy whisper. "They were sent away. On Thanksgiving." Samuel, intrigued, sits down. "What happened?" And so, as the sound of distant cannons rumbles across the river, Sarah tells him the story. She tells him of the proud Master Alistair and the sad Mistress Eleanor. She tells him of the children, and she tells him of a tall, quiet cook named Mary, a woman who carried a world of sorrow inside her and who, on one fateful night, decided she would carry it no longer. She tells him of the feast, the pie, and the madness that followed. She speaks of Mary walking out into the fog and disappearing from the world, leaving only a legend behind. Samuel listens, mesmerized. The story is more terrifying than any battlefield horror he has witnessed. The war is a chaos of noise and violence, but this was a different kind of violence. It was quiet, patient, and intimate. It was born in the heat of a kitchen and served with a silver fork. He looks at the old woman, at the people around him, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight, faces that have seen a lifetime of casual and deliberate cruelties. And he begins to understand the war he is fighting is not just about union or territory. It is about the monstrous sin that has been festering at the heart of the country for centuries. It is about purging a sickness. The story of Mary of Vicksburg is not a simple tale of murder. It is a story about poison. The slow, soul-killing poison of slavery that infected everyone it touched, master and slave, man and woman, parent and child. Alistair Beaumont built his house and his life on a foundation of human bondage, and that poison seeped up through the floorboards, tainted the food, and drove a quiet, dignified woman to an act of unspeakable, yet perhaps understandable, horror. What is the greater crime, the single, violent act of a desperate woman, or the vast, systemic crime that created her? The question hangs in the smoky air between the soldier from Ohio and the survivor from Mississippi. There is no easy answer. The story of Mary ends in ambiguity, her fate unknown, her body never found. She dissolved back into the American landscape, becoming a part of its haunting. She is a ghost, not of a person, but of a question. Her presence lingers, a whisper in the rustling leaves of the datura plant, a shadow on the muddy waters of the great river. The river that flows on, carrying its secrets, washing away the evidence but never the memory, a silent witness to the terrible, complicated heart of the nation it divides. It asks the question, over and over, with every slow, brown wave that breaks upon the shore. In a world of absolute power and absolute suffering, where does justice lie? And what is the price of a reckoning?